Hello and welcome to our 85th anniversary of the First Mass Transport Arriving to Auschwitz series. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for following us on Patreon if you have done. So, just a bit of a recap of where we've been. The First Mass Transport has now arrived to Auschwitz. They have been registered, they have undergone their first night. And I think Zane is now going to tell us about the next following 2 weeks of what happens to these poor men.
Yes, so there's the best way to describe it is pseudo sports exercises are going to begin with all of the prisoners, and it's going to last almost continuously for the next 2 weeks. And these prisoners are going to be beaten constantly. They're going to be deprived of water. Of course, they're going to be exhausted not just by fear, but by pain, heat, and of course, fatigue. People would be forced to perform physically exhausting exercises. Some would include being forced to jump or walk for hours in a squat, to fall and rise, to jump again, to squat, to bear walk. Then, of course, you've got full body twists, to roll in the dust, to climb the only tree that was growing there, and much, much more. And in all of this, it doesn't matter. I mean, we've talked a little bit about age, but it doesn't matter because even some of the youngest and fittest prisoners, they simply couldn't endure all of this for this long. Now, this gymnastics would be interrupted by learning to report in, to learn the camp rules, singing, and very specific camp drills. For instance, taking off and putting on a hat at command. Now, in layman's terms, it's all about being trained to be obedient. Now, songs, of course, would be sung in German, which would be problematic for those who were unable to speak German. They would also have to learn commands and how to reply, also in German. If they didn't do it correctly, of course, they would be beaten. If a prisoner, for instance, was not singing loud enough, or more importantly, not pronouncing the lyrics correctly because they don't speak German, they would be beaten mercilessly. Roll calls were also held for hours. They had to learn how to say their number in German, especially when a German would ask them at any moment. And of course, the SS euphemistically called this period a quarantine. It lasted a few weeks, but in the final period of the camp's existence, this quarantine, if you will, would only last a few days. And then, practically at the end, it was almost ceased. Now, a period of disciplining newcomers in camp procedures and removal of routines from their former lives. Moreover, fear would continue with beatings and abuse of prisoners, and constant and senseless sport would be aimed at selecting the physically and mentally weakest individuals and making them slaves of the German state, free and devoid of the spirit of resistance and personal dignity. It would also make the prisoners focus more on what they were doing rather than on trying to escape the hellish conditions that would be quarantine.
So, a lot of these prisoners, I mean, I myself can't imagine what the sport would have been like. I think it is one of the most evil concoctions. I mean, obviously there's many evil concoctions, but the sport for me, when you read the testimonies of prisoners and how they just couldn't do it anymore and they're being beaten left, right, and center, is just unimaginable at this point. But life in the camp does go on. The following transports that arrive happen 6 days after the first transport arrives. They arrive to the main part of the camp straight away. They don't go to the Monopoly building. So unofficially, I guess you could call them the first transport, but depends on who you really talk to and which historian you talk to. I'll stick with these guys as my first transport. The bottom line is these guys have to build the camp up. So what you see nowadays when you walk into Auschwitz is not what it looked like way back when it first opened. Blocks 1, 2, and 3 were the only ones. So that would be if you walk into the camp through the Arbeitermacht Freigate, walk up the main path straight ahead of you, and it's the last row of blocks on your left hand side, blocks 1, 2, and 3. If you go on one of those special tours, they take you into one of those blocks. Anyway, those are the blocks that were the first blocks used by these prisoners initially. And then obviously they started building up more and more parts of the camp. The center part, so those buildings right in the center, they never really existed, and they were built by prisoners. Block 11 was reconstructed by prisoners, obviously, for a prison within a prison. And the kitchen, the towers, the barbed wire, the plates under the barbed wire to stop people from digging out, everything and anything was built by the prisoners, and mostly by the Poles. Prisoners were straight away being taken to do various different jobs. So, obviously, if you were an electrician, or if you were, I don't know, had some sort of trade that was needed, you were first of all called up to go and work. And that was better than undergoing quarantine and having to do sport practically for 12 hours a day. So, as many prisoners as they could decided to join up, and the camp started to slowly and surely be built. Now, when it comes down to uniforms and clothing and things like that, the one thing we didn't talk about is that these first transport prisoners weren't allowed to have shoes. It took them, and most of you are not going to believe this, it took them 6 months to receive shoes. So they received shoes in December of 1940. Now, reminding you what the weather was like in Poland in the 1940s, it was snow and it was cold. So these prisoners, especially those who had to work outside, were being forced to work without shoes. The only prisoners that received shoes were the ones that worked in the fields. So if you worked unloading trains, or if you worked some other form of working outside, you were forced to work with no shoes. Even if you were in the camp, there still would be snow in the camp. It'd still be cold on the ground. So yeah, it took them 6 months to be able to have shoes. Photographs weren't taken yet, not until the end of 1940, beginning of 1941. Like I said before, you want to know more about the photography, then head to our Patreon for the Auschwitz Liberation podcast. The Penal Company was formed also. For many of you that don't know what the Penal Company is, it means that you most likely are not going to get out alive. The Penal Company first was made up of Jews and priests, and they were the ones that would work the hardest. They would create the paths. So if you've ever been to Auschwitz, you may have come across this really huge, large roller. That is one of the things that was used by the Penal Company to pull like an ox. So if you could imagine what an ox would be like pulling a roller, that's what actually prisoners were doing. The head of the capo for that, the Penal Company, his name was Ernest Krankemann. He actually ends up being sent to Sonnenstein on the 31st of July of 1941 as part of a selection process. He was morbidly obese. And when I mean morbidly obese, if you head to our Patreon, I will post up a picture of him, and then you can judge for yourselves how such a large man was able to be in a concentration camp. Prisoners were obviously moved into various different commandos, meaning work sections. They would do things like take care of the horses, tend the fields. Of course, Auschwitz had to be self-sufficient. They would have special commandos that would take care of the cows. You would be forced to dismantle the local buildings and homes and things like that to be able to get building materials for the camp itself. That was one of the most dangerous jobs you could have. You could also end up working in Bauhof, basically the place where they held building materials. Most of these jobs were very, very difficult and very, very hard, especially anything to do with building, and anything to do with outside were just beyond horrific. And the last thing I want to finish on is the first escape out of Auschwitz, and that is Tadeusz Wyjowski, who escapes on the 6th of July 1940. He actually came from the first transport, and he had the help of some of the electricians, and basically he was aided by some of the civilians who were hired to work in the camp, the electricians, and they gave him civilian clothing, money, food, and a green armband, a special armband that the civilian workers were required to wear to differentiate themselves from the Auschwitz prisoners. And more or less, he basically walked out of the camp with civilian workers. He boarded a train, and he ended up going to Spitkowice, trying to get back home. And it's not his escape that is what's truly horrific. it's what happens afterwards, and it's the particular cruelty that the SS inflict upon the prisoners. Every single prisoner that survived from this time period will clearly remember this day. It is imprinted in their memory. They will always talk about it, they will always mention it. And that is because they were forced to stand for a 19-hour roll call through the freezing night and through the burning hot day. Their shaved heads were burnt throughout the day, and many of them actually passed out. And the SS would mock the prisoners, they would beat them, they would humiliate them, they were forced to kneel with their hands behind their heads, stand to attention with their hands raised up by their heads, all sorts of continuous torture. Prisoners were not allowed to relieve themselves either, so they relieved themselves where they were standing, because the other horrific part of this is many of them suffered from diarrhea and other gastric problems, and they would literally just stand there and have diarrhea run down their legs. And those that were caught relieving themselves were forced to get on all fours, bark like a dog, and eat their own feces. So for me, it's probably one of the most horrific moments inflicted on these prisoners. 5 of the civilians were punished for aiding the escape. They were all interrogated in Block 11, denied food and water for 7 days, imprisoned in the camp. They were then sentenced to death, which was eventually commuted to 5 years in a concentration camp and 75 lashes. Now, Bolesław Beach, if I'm allowed to post this photo, I will. Now, Bolesław Beach survives. He's the only one that survives out of these 5 civilians. He was beaten till he passed out, and he ended up spending 7 months recovering in the camp hospital. Then he was sent to Mattenhausen when he was actually liberated. Now, the others didn't, and you can see the photographs. He dies, I think, in 1947 or 1948. He doesn't survive very long after the war, but there's photographs taken of his buttocks, and you can see the huge indents in his buttocks. It's horrific to think that this man suffered through 75 lashes. By the way, it wasn't just 75 lashes. He had to count every single one of those lashes. So not only was that, and if he lost his footing, they would start all over again. So most likely he got more than 75 lashes, and yeah, surviving and not living for very long. Anyway, enough of me talking. I think we should move on to Chris, because Chris, you're going to talk to us about what Auschwitz is realistically to actually become, because it isn't just a concentration camp, it's more, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you to say to anyone in the population in the world, so well, can you name a concentration camp? The chances are they'll say Auschwitz, and they'll also talk about the exterminations at Auschwitz. But it's not technically just Auschwitz. It's becomes an industrial complex in both forms of the word, and it's involved in indirect and direct extermination. Obviously, the direct being the gas chambers, indirect is just working people to death, poor conditions, something that they refer to at the Wannsee conference of natural wastage. You know, you let disease and poor conditions thin their numbers, but it, you end up with something like 40 subcamps. We did talk about them during our uh, in depth in our Patreon for our Auschwitz Liberation podcast, and they range from like the Gestapo prisoners, of which there's only 10 of them, up to hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Often you have labor working in German industry, including the Kruppwerks and any kind of labor, also farming labor. But you also, as I said, have the liquidation, and they become really quite, I don't want to use the word efficient, but efficient at what they do. For example, during the sort of summer of 1944, you have 142 trains of Hungarian Jews or come to Auschwitz, and over the course of the 3 months, 75% of the 350,000 people are executed and completely liquidated, and that's just amazing sort of German efficiency. It's a dark play. It is a dark stain on human history that this was allowed to happen, and it just because the levels of brutality and sadism and sheer callousness is just horrendous. And if you want to go into a lot more detail, do go back and check out our Auschwitz Liberation podcast, because there are some really quite horrific and yet some wonderful stories that come out of it of human heroism in the face of just pure evil.
Well, that's it for this series. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for listening. Please do head to our Patreon account to listen to us blabber on a little bit more about the first transport, Poland, Auschwitz, and other aspects of what else we've been discussing here on the main feed. Again, thank you so much. Just a note, we will be coming back in 2 weeks' time where we will be having a bit of a break from our regular series and we will be talking to some historians on the Second World War. Chris, Zane, and I have some absolutely amazing guests coming up on the feed, so do watch out for that. Thank you so much again, and we will see you in a couple of weeks' time.